Ethnic racial socialization of biracial children and the fear of abandonment and rejection. To understand the origins of some of the problems biracial children in the United States have. Understanding how biracial identity development, which is influenced by contextual environmental factors such as family structure and parental racial socialization practices, is critically important. In multiracial nations like the United States, you also have to consider the enormous influence that Black parents have when they become racially involved in socialization as a protective factor in the development of their children. And why not talk about how the development of the sense of racial identity is a central component of healthy identity development in biracial children. Something that people need to understand about the development of racial identity is that it varies, it changes throughout the life course. It is not a predictable linear process with a single outcome, and social, cultural, and environmental context are critical influences in racial identity. Given that structural racism in many post-slavery multiracial nations such as the United States, which is associated in many cases with poor health, behavioral problems, including poor academic performance, use of prohibited substances, emotional problems such as anxiety and depression, are fundamental products of racial and ethnic discrimination that many of them suffer during childhood. Racial ethnic family socialization is the process by which family members and relatives communicate messages to children about the meanings and consequences surrounding racial and ethnic identity. This form of socialization helps establish identity and emphasizes the role of the family in creating congruence in the formation of racial ethnic identity. Through ethnic racial family socialization, children learn about phenotypic and cultural differences, history, heritage, identity politics, prejudice and discrimination, but also those behaviors, thoughts and belief systems that reduce the negative effects that are associating structural racism. Families composed of racially different monoracial Black or white parents raising biracial children, where the racial profiling, perception, personal experience, personality type, and skin tone of biracial children is the focus of monoracial parents. The level of personal acceptance and orientations of parents towards biracial children versus monoracial children is an element that we must analyze to understand the reasons why some biracial children tend to identify themselves with the racial identity of the parent, whose sense of identity. Racial is extremely important when we talk about the challenges faced by Black monoracial parents, in which empathy, feelings of rejection, search for acceptance and fear of abandonment are factors to consider when a biracial child self-identifies as Black, so as not to disappoint a monoracial parent. Parenting studies have documented that parents attempt to instill in their children the skills they themselves have needed to function effectively within this context, with the fight against structural racism in the spotlight. Consequently, parents who experience discrimination are expected to be more likely than others to anticipate that their children will also experience discrimination, and providing their children with tools to deal with it is one we need to understand. Studies suggest that parents' racial ethnic socialization messages are not static or constant throughout childhood, but rather change according to children's cognitive abilities and experiences. As children grow older, their rudimentary knowledge as an adult about understanding race increases, but also how racial differences affect the way others look at you, value you, and treat you. Studies of how the neighborhood environment and experiences of discrimination shape the ethnic racial socialization of parents underscore the importance of understanding aspects of the ecological experiences of parents and youth in relation to the messages that children receive. In particular, when the characteristics of environments make race very salient, such as when environments are ethnically integrated or highly discriminatory, parents are more likely to communicate messages associated with ethnicity, but also with differences children's races. One of the main functions of ethnic racial socialization may be to enable young people to recognize and deal with social discrimination. Among the dimensions of ethno-racial socialization that we have proposed, preparation for prejudice can be expected to be especially influential in this regard. because it presumably includes prescriptions for dealing with discrimination. However, other aspects of ethnic racial socialization can influence the confrontation as well. To understand how the process of socialization, family upbringing, culture integration, emotional growth, personal interaction and sense of belonging are elements to consider when we analyze these elements as factors that influence when biracial children define their racial identity. Emotional conflicts between biracial children with monoracial parents can produce fear of abandonment, rejection, low self-esteem, low self-worth, anxiety, and negative self-perception if the biracial child does not meet the demands of monoracial parents. Anyone who has studied basic psychology concludes that the avoidance of danger is a much stronger emotion than the pursuit of pleasure. The first is an instinctive response product of the life preservation mechanism, and the second is a mental need, which can be biologically motivated and also emotionally learned. In a child there is no worse feeling than the fear of abandonment, and more so if that child is of mixed race. Mixed-race children whose family members are racially different, which does not produce a sense of group identity, but neither does the sense of belonging, creating a sense of an uncertain future. How does fear of rejection and abandonment by Black parents force biracial children to identify as Black? It is the topic that we will analyze as a way of understanding the racial identity conflicts that some biracial children suffer. Children of parents of different racial groups, where the sense of identity is the center of attention. When not well managed, it tends to produce internal conflict in biracial children, which produces behavior considered uncontrollable and unresponsive to the demands of monoracial parents. Parents with a healthy sense of identity racial don't impose on children a racial identity that is not associated with their nature as a person of mixed race, but when one of the parents has racial identity as the center of attention, product of racism, the imposition of this racial identity is a response to these racial conflicts. Conflict that a biracial child is not aware exists. When parents try to impose ideas, behaviors and beliefs that the child perceives as harmful to physical integrity, general welfare, sense of identity, emotional health, but also individual choice, defiance and conflicting emotions is something to be expected between parents and children. Let's not talk between biracial children and parents who are racially different from them. When the parents are the ones who are trying to impose an identity on a biracial child, which is not associated with their nature as a person of mixed race, the results are the racial identity conflicts that some biracial children have, a product of the need that the biracial children meet the expectations of parents monoracial from different racial groups, but also their own needs. Unresolved conflicts between parents and children tend to produce a feeling of abandonment, if the parents don't recognize the source of the conflict. To avoid any parental response that produces a feeling of abandonment or loss of family support in many cases, biracial children produce submissive behaviors to avoid these conflicting feelings. As a way to appease the negative responses of racially different parents, who want to impose their own racial identity on biracial children, they end up complying with the parents' demands, as a way to neutralize conflicting feelings as a result of this imposition. All biracial children, when discovering the racial differences or skin color between them and their parents, tend to seek parental acceptance associated with skin color using racial validation. The stronger the fear of rejection, the greater the behavior aimed at appeasing the negative responses of the parents, and more when parents who have racial identity as the focus of attention. Many biracial reject mixed race identity out of fear of abandonment and rejection by one of their Black parents. Right now there are many biracial people who are unconsciously afraid of feeling abandoned by their parents. Feeling of abandonment that is transferred from the family to the social sphere. A child who is the product of good upbringing, seeking parental validation is normal in the early years, but when an adult seeks personal validation from other adults, it is symptoms of emotional behavior dependent on a group structure. For the biracial child, The feeling of belonging, acceptance and love from parents of different racial groups is extremely important in the emotional development of children, where the fear of abandonment is not part of their lives. When you look at the group dependency behavior of many biracial people, who are pandering to black people, it tells you that the unconscious fear of abandonment is what is motivating behavior that diffuses negative black reactions. For some reasons, children tend to fear parental abandonment because it puts a child's life in danger. For the same reason, in a society like the United States, where racial identity is synonymous with group identity, the loss of support from that group tends to produce fear of abandonment in biracial children, but also in adults. For a biracial child, there is a correlation between the fear of abandonment and the type of emotional support they receive from their parents at the time they develop a sense of identity. For historical reasons that we all know, the biracial mulatto identity is not part of the collective consciousness of the black, much less of the biracial, which is one of the reasons that stops the formation of a biracial community of mulattoes. The child biracial does not know how to choose a family structure during its growth, which can justify the fear of abandonment for having a different type of complexion than the parents. But such internalized fears only exist when parents try to impose a racial identity on them, which does not correspond to his biracial nature as a mixed-race child. Some parents also tend to project their own unresolved conflicts associated with the racial differentials that exist between them, as monoracial parents in which the child's biracial identity is part of this conflict as a mixed-race couple. Monoracial black parents raising children who exhibit particular characteristics related to racial ethnic family socialization. Racial context is a way of describing aspects of racism, prejudice, discrimination, oppression, segregation, and status variables that which bite the ideas, behavior, socialization and mentality of people of color in the United States. Many monoracial parents of biracial children must understand that knowing the racial differences between parents and children is only one factor that leads to good parenting. The mistake that many monoracial parents make is, when they treat biracial children differently than monoracial children, forgetting that both racial groups have the same emotional, nutritional, educational and personal acceptance needs. I am of the opinion that the emotional health of biracial children is above a sense of racial identity, which is only important for monoracial parents. For me, the most important thing is not the feelings of monoracial parents, whether black or white, but the general well-being of biracial children when they grow up in a family environment free of conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this content, please subscribe to this channel and leave your comments.